He. All persons having anything to do before the Honorable, the Justice E. Susan Gosh of the Superior Court, now sitting at Fall River within and for the Commonwealth. Draw near, give your attendance, and you shall be heard. God save the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Court is in session. Be seated, please.
Return to 2013-983, Commonwealth versus Aaron Hernandez.
Yes, sir.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I know it may have been difficult for some of you, perhaps all of you, to get here this morning given the additional snow accumulation, so thank you very much. Let me ask you, have any of you seen or heard or read or overheard anything at all about this case or Mr. Hernandez since I last inquired? There are no affirmative responses. Have any of you discussed this case in any way, shape, or fashion, or Mr. Hernandez with anyone at all since I last inquired? There are no affirmative responses. And have any of you had any difficulty following any of my instructions not to talk about or in any way communicate anything about or look at or listen to or do any research about Mr. Hernandez, this case, or anything you think might in any way be relevant to the case? There are no affirmative responses. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Good morning, Mr. Leal.
Good morning, sir.
So when we left off on Friday, we were having some questioning about one of the two sorts of routed calls. Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
And so in your stack of records, Exhibit 246, 556 pages, there are a number of entries that have a routed call, and you testified that that concerns a voicemail, correct?
Yes, there are two different types of rounded calls, but yes.
And so, just to show you page 1 of Exhibit 246, do you see the second line there?
I do.
And that reflects that someone using 9656 phone number called the 4304 phone number and it went into voicemail. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And you can tell that because in the fourth column it says routed call, and in the second column it gives this 6245 series of numbers.
Correct. Yes.
And so you conclude from that that there was that was a routed call denoting a voicemail, correct?
Yes, sir.
And we also talked about the duration of the call. Line 2 says 2 seconds, and I think you testified on Friday that that probably meant that the person that was calling, the Sprint customer, hung up as soon as the voicemail started to play its recording.
Possibly, yes.
Now, we got a little off track or had a little trouble understanding each other when we were talking about the other sort of routed call. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think you testified that the second type of routed call is always an incoming call to the Sprint customer.
Correct.
And that you can tell that it is the second type of routed call because there'll be a pair of entries in your records, correct?
Yes, sir.
And typically those entries are one on top of another or are adjacent to each other. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, I think when you picked out one of the entries that we looked at as we suspended, you were saying, well, I have to look at some other pages because this might be an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours off. Do you remember that?
Yes, sir.
And by that, you were suggesting that if that if there was a difference in time zones, then the paired calls might be separated by an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. Is that what you were suggesting?
Yes, sir, and I don't think that was the case in the scenario. I was just missing one line.
So I'm going to show you a different set of paired calls, and maybe that'll make it more clear, okay?
Yes, sir.
So let's look at page 501. Can you see those numbers, sir?
I can.
So, I'm going to try to place the pad on the paper to highlight a pair of routed calls or a pair of lines that reflect a routed call. So do you see the two lines immediately above the notepad?
Yes, do you mind just opening it up even farther, like, so I can see the rest of the page?
Yes, I'll
Because
try to do that.
Yes, sir, thank you.
A little bit more?
A little bit more.
How's that?
It's good.
All right. So, am I correct in understanding that the two lines immediately above the notepad are a pair, and the call, it's one phone call and it was a routed call?
Yes, sir.
And it was a routed call of the second type.
Correct.
And so, in this instance, would I be correct in understanding that a call came to the Sprint customer, the 4304 number,
Yes, sir.
and the call came from a number 305-781-4233? Is that correct?
Absolutely correct, sir.
And then in the third column, it says dialed digits, correct?
Yes.
And I think you testified for an ordinary call, not routed, that would reflect the number that the initiating party actually punched into his or her phone.
Yes, sir.
But that's different when it's a routed call, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And that's something that the Sprint system just assigns, even though the calling party did not dial those numbers.
Correct.
And the reason it works like that is that there are times when the Sprint customer is outside of his or her typical calling area, correct?
Yes, sir.
So if I live in Fall River, and that's where I make most of my calls from or to, and I go to New Jersey, and I'm a Sprint customer, then I might have a routed call if I'm in New Jersey.
Right, so if the home telephone number, somebody's calling them from outside of their normal coverage area, it has to be assigned a TLDN or a temporary local routing number. And those numbers are internal to Sprint, and that's the number that's the 9844 number. That
In the
number.
third column.
Yes, sir, and in the second column. But that number facilitated that function to get it to its final destination. And those numbers are internal to Sprint. Their only function is to get the call to its final destination.
And I think you said that if the second line is part of that same call, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so if we stick with the first line, you'll see it says inbound, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that means that somebody is calling the Sprint customer.
Can you drop it down for me a little bit? Okay.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
So you see I'm pointing to inbound.
Yes, sir.
All right? That's the first line of this call, correct?
Correct.
And then the second line of it, again, it has the initiating number, the 4233 number.
Yes, sir.
And then it says the call number is this 9844, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, that's not really the number that the 305 number called, right?
Correct.
And then the dialed digits, again, is the 9844. That's not really what was dialed.
No, sir.
And so that, we know that because it says routed call, correct?
Yes, sir.
And then another thing I think you said is that if you compare the start and end times, they're going to be very close. Correct?
Yes. Yes.
And the duration is going to be very close. Correct?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the one other question I had about this routed call business is it, if I'm a customer here in Fall River, is it only when I'm out of my typical area that I'll get a routed call? Or is it the case that I'll get a routed call if the person trying to reach me is out of my typical area?
It's when the person trying to reach you is out of their typical area, as well as it can be the opposite way. It's when it's a call coming into that telephone, your specific telephone for the user. In this case, it's 860-845-4304.
Yes.
Somebody's calling into that user, and their home phone is out of the normal coverage area.
All right, so that was the example I was trying to give you a minute ago.
Yes.
So if I'm a Fall River customer and I typically use the phone here, and I go to New Jersey, then typically someone trying to reach me is going to get a routed call.
But it's only incoming to the user. It only pertains to that telephone number. If another user, I'm not trying to confuse anybody, but if they're on the Sprint network as well, and they're outside, when somebody tries to call them and they're outside of their home network, same type of situation is going to take place. A routing number is going to facilitate.
Let's still make it more complicated.
I'm not.
Okay. So the other thing that can happen is if I'm here in Fall River with my phone, this is my typical home area, and somebody's calling me from New Jersey. Is that going to get routed as well?
It's only incoming calls.
Yes.
And it
You're calling
depends,
me.
it depends on where the target phone is when it's being received. The call is being received.
So if it's in New Jersey, that's outside of my bailiwick. That's going to be a routed call?
If it's incoming to the target phone, and the target phone is outside of its normal coverage area, it's going to get routed for it to get facilitated. Yes.
Okay. And so, putting aside the question of whether somebody's in a different time zone, your records typically would reflect a routed call by having the lines adjacent in this printout. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the only reason that they would be separated would be if one of them is in a different time zone?
Right. So the calling number, doing the dialing, trying to get to the other phone is outside of the normal coverage area. In this case, it's time zones out.
Yep.
It's going to show a difference in time according to the standard time of wherever that person is that's dialing into this number.
So, in other words, if I'm here in Fall River and somebody in California is trying to call me, the first part of the call will reflect Pacific Standard Time.
Pacific time, correct.
And the second part of the call will reflect Eastern Time.
Correct.
And so they wouldn't be adjacent to each other as it's printed out.
Correct. So you'd have to go back 3 hours
Okay.
to put the two together. And the only way you put the two together is to look at the routing number, the number that's in the called number column and the number that's in the dial digits column. You have to find that number. And then the time is going to be essentially pretty close in time, as I spoke to earlier, as far as there'll be a variation of a few seconds, but it's typically 2 to 3 seconds.
Let me show you a different, let me just make sure I remember this correctly. The calls that are listed on the call detail record, this 556-page record.
Yes, sir.
Are the actual, the time listed is the actual time the call was made or received by the customer. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
So if I'm in the Eastern time zone, the time for my phone is going to reflect Eastern time.
Yes, sir.
And if I'm in California, the time in your record is going to reflect Pacific time.
Yes, sir.
And the time listed is the time for my phone, the Sprint customer, not the person trying to contact me.
The time reflects whatever the phone number is on the record, at the top of the record. So whoever's record those are, it's only for the target phone.
Okay.
So it's only going to reflect information on that telephone number.
That's different from the text messages, which always appear in Central Time.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, I have one other area that I wanted to ask you about. Let me show you page 500 of your records, and I see a entry that says in the fourth column, undetermined. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Is that big enough for you to read?
It is.
Could you explain what that entry means?
Absolutely. For whatever reason, the system didn't catch whether it was what portion that was, whether it was outbound, inbound, routed. So the routed piece didn't show up. But you have to put two and two together. And so by looking at it, it might say undetermined, but you know that the calling number was 203-606-8969, and it dialed the 860-845-4304 number, and that's what happened. You see that next number there, the 992-9840 number?
In the third column?
Yes.
Yes.
So that's a routing number.
Okay.
So this is a situation that I spoke to earlier, like I have to match that up. So it's going to be in these records somewhere, but it could be an hour off, it could be 2 hours off, it could be 3 hours off. And so I would have to review that, and it might be on the page prior, or it might be forward, in order to find that actual piece.
So a clue for us, if we're worried about whether a call going to the Sprint customer is coming from a different time zone, or that Sprint customer is in a different time zone, would be undetermined. And then you would know to look around an hour, or 2 hours, or 3 hours apart.
Right, typically it's going to be showing routed, and then you're going to have the inbound portion. It might be that's the situation here, but for whatever reason, the system designated as undetermined.
It's just like some of the issues you talked about on Friday. Occasionally the system has a glitch and doesn't record it accurately, and this is such an occasion.
Well, not that it didn't record it appropriately, it just for whatever reason it came out undetermined. But if you put the pieces together, you can see that the call took place, and there's going to be an inbound portion and a routing portion. It might have showed as undetermined, possibly it was routed in that line, and for whatever reason it didn't catch that. So we'd have to look at the second piece in order to look at it to determine that.
Those are all the questions I have. Thank you. Judge, can we see his cover?
If I could, I just on Friday, and it's my error. These are also records of Sprint relating to cell locations, is that correct?
Yes, they are.
And again, maintained in the normal course, in good faith, relied on by Sprint, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Subjection, subject to the discussion.
Objection overruled, may be marked as the next exhibit.
Page 49.
Now, if I may, I'm just, you use the phrase target number or
Yes, sir.
target phone, correct?
Yes, sir.
And could you just, I think you gave sort of at least some description of what you mean by that, but could you just tell the jurors, please, what you mean by target phone or target number?
So it's the number that is on the record as far as who those records belong to. That, and when I say who, the telephone number. That's all it is. And
And
so,
when you, that's your Sprint customer, correct?
absolutely correct.
And so when you're talking about your records, you're talking about a target phone, and in the case of exhibit number 246, that target phone number is the 860-845-4304 number, correct?
Correct.
And so in regards to routing and where the phone is, that's the phone that Sprint is concerned with, correct?
Absolutely correct.
And if somebody else is calling, particularly if they're calling from a different carrier, Sprint isn't tracking those locations where that phone is, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, I'm just going to show you page 500 there, and I think you were just talking to Mr. Rankin about a call, but looking now at the sort of progression of that record, can you familiarize yourself with that page 500, please?
Can. Okay.
Okay? Now, I'm trying to show it on the viewer. Could you just tell us sort of what's on that first line, and do you have to read that first line in conjunction with the second line?
Yes.
Okay, and tell us what is there and why you have to read it in conjunction with the second line.
Okay, so in this transaction, it's two lines. It's an inbound call to 860-845-4304. The calling that number is 203-606-8969. It calls 860-845-4304. When it hits the switch recognizes that the call needs to get to its destination. So it utilizes 305-992-9829, which is a temporary local routing number. Its only function is to get it to its final destination. So it can get to 860-845-4304. The second line shows that process happening as a routed call. The first line shows the inbound portion. The second line shows the routed portion. It shows the 9829 number twice in both lines.
Now, the very next line is an outbound call, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so that never will appear in the record as a routed call, correct?
Absolutely correct.
Now, the next two lines, I believe Mr. Rankin was asking you about the fourth line down, but I'm going to ask you to look at the fourth and fifth line, and then we're just going to skip ahead to the sixth line, okay?
Okay?
You see the sixth line there? That's an outbound call, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
That also needs no routing, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
In looking at all of those lines now, are you able to tell us about the third and the fourth line, or the fourth and the fifth lines as they appear there on the record?
Yes.
Do those have to be read together?
No, they do not.
And why is that, please?
Because it's showing a routing number, but that doesn't mean that it's showing the TLDN. The TLDN is not there.
Now, the fifth line is a routed call to voicemail, is that correct?
Yes.
Does that normally appear as a two-line transaction?
No,
Not necessarily, or not at all?
it doesn't.
Okay.
Typically, no.
And so that line above it there, the undetermined, is it the circumstance in which that indicates because there's a TLDN that there's an incoming call to the phone?
Correct.
Now, you indicated on Friday, I think, in response to a question from Mr. Rankin, just you do not maintain cell tower records related to text messages. Is that correct?
Correct, because they travel through a gateway.
Now, and that is the practice of Sprint, as far as you don't know what the other practices of other companies are. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
You may sit down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Justin Darrow, please, Your Honor.
Please face the clerk. Raise your right hand.
Do you solemnly swear that your testimony will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Good morning, sir. Could you please state your full name and spell your full name for the record?
Justin Darrow. Last name Darrow, D-A-R-R-O-W.
And your first name, if you could spell that, just so we
sorry.
have the proper spelling as well.
Justin, J-U-S-T-I-N.
And are you employed, sir?
I am.
And could you tell us, please, where are you employed?
I'm employed with Sprint.
And what is your work with Sprint, please?
I'm a radio frequency engineer.
And how long have you been with Sprint?
Since 1996.
And could you tell us, please, what is a radio frequency engineer?
Radio frequency engineer is in charge, we'll say, oversees the Sprint wireless network. That could be anything related to customer trouble tickets, drop calls, block calls, network performance, network optimization, direction of traffic, for example, those type of things, customer trouble tickets.
And where are you physically located in your normal day-to-day work? please?
I'm located at 9 Barnes Industrial Road in Wallingford, Connecticut.
In Connecticut.
Yes.
And could you just tell us about your educational background in order to become a radio frequency engineer?
Sure. I went to school at Greater New Haven State Technical College in North Haven, Connecticut, for an associate's degree in electrical engineering technology. Sometime later, as an adult student, I graduated from Quinnipiac University with a bachelor's degree in organizational leadership. and I'm currently pursuing my master's degree at the University of New Haven for engineering and operations management.
And can you tell us sort of how you got started working in cellular communications in,
Sure.
in that business, and when that was, please?
So back in 1992, I actually interviewed with Bell Atlantic 9X Mobile, which is now Verizon, also in Wallingford, Connecticut, and was actually hired on as a test driver. Associate engineer, I guess, was my title at that point.
And what is a test driver?
So one of the great things about starting out in the business is that I was forced to learn the network. So in doing that, we basically had to try to mirror the customer experience. So we had our computer set up, we had phones where we could simulate what the customer experience was like, whether that be complaints of drop calls, test driving for handovers from site to site as you travel, for example. We did a lot of network expansion at that point, the building of new sites, so we had to integrate those into the network. And for the most part, that was my first 2 to 2.5 years within the industry.
And when you describe this test driving, or is it commonly referred to as drive testing in the business?
Yes.
What does that entail, please?
It entails a series of phone calls and recording that phone call data, measured data, as you travel. Again, looking for things like drop calls, looking for signal strength, excuse me, let me back up. I feel like I'm speaking very quickly. Okay, I'm better now. It's a big case, sorry. Sorry. So what would happen was we would have a series of phones. Something more than 2, for example. A long call and a short call, for example. And we would use the short call to continue to make phone calls into the network quickly, basically to try to log things like success rate, successful call, drop calls, that kind of thing. And a longer call to try to, I guess, monitor and track how that phone would hand from site to site within the network. So when you do that, you're obviously looking for problems, and when you find those problems, we I guess would use that information to better those sites, to optimize those sites, fix those sites, and improve the customer experience.
And that process of drive testing and using the telephones, is that an accepted practice in the cell phone industry?
Absolutely, yes.
And does that continue to go on even through today?
It does. It's actually used to incorporate that data into a lot of the computer modeling software, prediction files, for example, so that one, I guess, could not only have drive data, real live data that's collected, but also be able to incorporate that into software tools so that we can make predictions and modify the system accordingly.
Now, after your initial entry there, doing that, you said that you went on and worked in the switch?
I did. For about a year and a half, I worked in the switch.
What is the switch, please?
So the switch would be the, I guess, larger computer, the main computer that basically is the hub of the network. So individual sites, for example, throughout the network would communicate back to the switch, and the switch would I guess, ensure that those sites all interacted together. And that could be in terms of timing, that could be in terms of parameters within the different sites, how those different sites interact together.
Now, you indicated that you began there at Bell Atlantic 9X in 1992, correct?
I did, yes.
And did you then move on to Sprint?
I did in '96 when Sprint started to build out the Sprint PCS wireless network.
And have you been working for Sprint since that time, 1996?
I have in various different companies that they have.
And can you describe the types of positions and the type of work that you've done with Sprint since you've been there in, beginning in 1996, please?
Sure. So the first couple of years was dedicated to the build out again of the Sprint PCS network. So it was a new network at that point. So we basically started the build out of what you see as individual sites, which could be a tower, could be location on a billboard, whatever the case may be, where the individual antennas are placed. And at that point, there were no Sprint PCS sites on air. So again, in those first 2 years, I was part of the team that built out the Sprint PCS network within the Connecticut market.
And since that time, has the technology continued to evolve such that the network is now referred to by a different, is it a different type of network, I guess?
Well, currently we're doing a massive conversion to the LTE network, if that's what you're referring to. Yes.
And just tell us how it is that you've gone from what it was originally to what it is now.
So the network originally at one point was, I guess, what you would refer to as a 2G network, really a voice network, analog network, which has progressed over time. I probably couldn't quote exact years in which those transformations took place. It's probably better that I don't. But it evolved from 2G into, I guess, a 3G network, if you will. I guess what we really call a legacy data network. So a much slower data speed than you utilize now with LTE. LTE is a much faster, robust digital network with things like IP backhaul, very large channels. For example, the 2G network had channels that were about a megahertz and a quarter wide. Now we're talking about channels that are minimum of 5 megahertz wide, in some cases even 20 megahertz. Things have taken place, upgrades have taken place, like the utilization of fiber networks. We now put radios on the towers, for example, right near the antennas for a little less loss. There's fiber connectivity between the top of the antenna down to some of the other equipment that's housed. So all that has progressed into a network to support all the media that one uses on a smartphone these days.
And during that time, as the network progressed, were you involved with the design of the network in Sprint, including cell site locations and how they interacted with each other?
I was. So at a period in about 2005, I'll say, I was actually the manager for the design team out of the New York office, the White Plains office. So I had a team of, I don't know, I think about 8 people, and 8 employees, and I believe there were 3 contractors at the time. And we were responsible for a different area. I was responsible for portions of New York, Connecticut, upstate New York, about midway, so to speak, not upper upstate, if you will. And we were at one point building out, I would say, anywhere from 50 to 60, 70 sites a year for that period.
And has that building out of sites essentially slowed down?
Absolutely, yes.
And why is that, please?
At the time, there was a pretty big budget crunch that came through for Sprint. I'll leave it at that. I don't,
But at the same time, in the building out process, have the sort of cell locations been optimized to an extent?
I will agree with that, but keep in mind at that point that was the 3G network. Now that we've evolved to LTE and the 4G network, there's been a massive conversion, an upgrade, if you will, of the equipment, and some of that equipment I just described. And then now, present day, we're getting into some budget that's being released for new build-out of sites.
Now, but as the network existed in 2013, were well, let me ask it to you this way. What is a cell tower or a cell site? Are those two words interchangeable?
Yes. So I can give you an example.
Please.
When we're on break, for example, and we all leave the court, or some of you that have left the court, in this very hallway, if you look out 2 blocks over, there's 2 smokestacks. There's a WOW smokestack, and then there's a smokestack to the left, which has 3 series of antenna array on there, located on that smokestack. And by and large, there is a cell site is made up of an antenna array that's placed around, in this example, a smokestack, divided up into 3 parts, each covering about 120 degrees to provide 360 degrees of coverage. And those 3 breakouts are referred to as a sector. So I might say cell site, I might say sector. It's interchangeable.
Now, in the sort of planning out of the location of cell sites, do you take into account the area that you are covering and the users that you're servicing?
Absolutely. So when
Describe how you do that, please.
So when you do any type of design work, or even optimization work for that matter, there's really 3 things that one worries about. Coverage, capacity, and interference. So coverage would be how large would your network be, for example. What area you're trying to cover, whether it be the city, whether it be a rural area. And then there's different site spacing that are utilized in those different areas. And then you have the capacity of a network, how much area you're trying to cover. Excuse me. How many subscribers are you trying to cover? So we have to take into consideration things like events that take place, where large clusters of people will be, busy sections of town, those kind of things. And then you have the interference piece, which is a little tricky to describe, but basically it's a negative to the system design. You have to be careful of the potential of interference within your network. So just like when you're on the phone and you're in a large area and somebody starts yelling, it's hard for you to hear. The phone operates in much the same way. It has to adjust its power to try to compensate for that rise in noise floor. That's more electronic than verbal, but there has to be some compensation for that. And if any time that happens, that's really an interference correction. And certainly if the phone can't compensate for that interference, then that's a real problem. That becomes something that would be negative to the subscriber experience, for example.
Now, so taking that into account, can you tell us how is it that you plan locations, and actually after you plan a location, do you go back, as you indicated, through drive testing or customer feedback and try and optimize the coverage that you're trying to serve?
Absolutely. So you would have to tailor the sites as they're introduced into the network, even existing sites for that matter. They all interact with each other. So with the goal in mind of minimizing drop calls and block calls and that type of thing, you would have to do things like set timers, for example. You would have to set different parameters to trigger to different technologies, for example, between the LTE network, for example, back down to the 3G network, because there's certainly customers still on those networks. You would have to optimize the neighbor list, which is kind of a larger subject, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But for the most part, you have to, I guess, introduce that site into the network and make it aware of the surrounding sites, to be overly simple.
And do you have sort of different approaches to dealing with calls in urban areas, rural areas, and areas along major roadways?
Absolutely.
Can you describe how that all factors into what you do, please?
So certainly, highways in rural areas would have fewer sites in a given area, what we would call site density, fewer sites over the span of, I don't know, a few miles, versus something, sites that are placed in the middle of an urban area, for example, which would have a much higher site density, more sites in a given area. We'll say that the rural sites probably can get away with a little bit of a weaker coverage, for example, because you're trying to maintain coverage on the highways, but you also realize as you get off the highways, you don't have as many sites in a given area, so those sites might thin out and you might have to compensate for that weaker coverage. On the other hand, in a rural area where there's many more sites, the signal strength...
I'm sorry, you said rural, I think you meant urban, is that correct?
I did mean urban, thank you. In those urban areas where you have many more sites, the signal strength is much higher because you have sites very close to each other. So a portion of that stronger strength, for example, higher power, may not be usable because you have to optimize the sites such that they will not necessarily act as if they're the only site, the strongest site in that area. You have to optimize it such that you create the handover boundary between two sites equally, for example. And then as you drive through, say, several sites at that stronger strength, higher signal strength, one site would not necessarily service all the traffic. It would hand over to its neighboring site, which may be a quarter mile away, for example. That's just one example.
As it regards highways, do you do something to try and ensure continuous coverage along major roadways?
Yeah, the sites are a bit higher, for example. We certainly direct the antennas along those main roadways. I would say that there's also down tilt that's introduced into the antenna. So not only do we turn them, we can also pivot them up and down, for example, slightly. So those type of things are done.
Now, can you describe, please, for us how it is that the cell site connects with the cellular telephone, and then what happens to the call, either as it moves through the cell site into the network or out of the network through the cell site to the phone?
Sure. So two things happen the first time in a given day that you would use your phone. Let's just say that in the morning you use your phone and you try to make a call. When you do that, prior to the phone ringing or prior to even hearing ringing on the other end of that phone, and you try to make a call, the network will try to establish as to whether or not you're even a valid subscriber. So is your bill paid? Does that phone call need to be routed back over to customer service? Whatever the case may be. And the second thing is that, excuse me, give me just a second. The second thing is that the network wants to be able to communicate to you, in essence, be able to locate you. And That doesn't mean find you on the corner of Main and Washington. It means be able to communicate with you within the given area of a site's coverage. So for the most part, it will try to establish connectivity based on where it thought you were last within the network. When it can't find you, if it can't find you, it will expand that coverage out to a cluster of sites. If you want to refer to that as a location area, paging zone, whatever the case may be, but there's an expansion that occurs. And if it can't obviously find you within that area, say in the cluster of sites within a city, it will expand that out to, say, the county level. And then ultimately, if it needs to continue to do that, it'll expand statewide and potentially even to neighboring switches, neighboring networks. Again, in this example, all within the Sprint network, but still trying to communicate you and find you. And one of the things that happens when that's occurring is that there are messages, for example, that are repeated, and there are a series of expected returns. So in other words, if in that communication it's trying to communicate back and forth between the site and the cell site, and it sends out 7 messages back and forth, it would expect to, for example, receive 5 of those in order to establish that there's good communication. There's also things like timers where within the course of those messages, it would expect to have received a reply within X number of milliseconds. And if it doesn't do that, then that's one way in doing that, that's one way to categorize, for example, potentially best server based on, say, power and quality, for example.
Meaning, all of this is going back and forth between the cell site or cell sites and the phone, is that correct?
And as a matter of fact, the phone at this point hasn't even rung. So you might hear your series of click tones, that type of thing, while the network is searching to make that communication. And those click tones are there so that you potentially don't hang up. You realize something is happening. So then at that point, once that sequence is finished, then you would be assigned a talk channel. And let me just clarify that most of which I just described is really considered overhead messaging. And the reason, even to be more clear, that the network wants to find you based on your last location, for example, is to minimize those resources. It's a drain to the system to do these wide searches, for example. So there is a slow expansion to try to locate and communicate to your phone. So then at this point now we've established a talk channel, and you can continue on with or you could begin your conversation. While you're speaking, there's also 2 things that are happening while the phone is in conversation, and that is that many times per second the phone is trying to either increase or decrease its power, regulate its power, to kind of keep, in terms of interference, the least amount of, I guess, I don't have a good word for it, but it tries to speak at a whisper above the crowd, if you will. That's the amount of power that the phone is trying to utilize. Just so that
you say it's trying to use the least amount of power necessary in order to communicate with the cell
That's
site.
an excellent way to say it. Thank you.
So the phone is doing that back and forth with the cell site, is that correct?
That's right.
And what else is happening?
And then there's also, as I mentioned before, a neighbor list that is active.
And so just describe for us, please, what a neighbor list is and where that is going on.
So a neighbor list is basically a classification and ranking prioritization of all the surrounding sites that are either heard or measured by the phone as your conversation is occurring. So with the idea that the phone is trying to utilize the strongest, most clear signal possible, it is continuously ranking those secondary sites to try to find and hand you off to a potentially better serving site.
And so how, in the interaction between the cell phone and the cell site, how does the network determine which site the phone will use, please?
Initially, it is based on estimated, and I say initially meaning prior to the phone ringing, for example. It is based on estimated strongest and best quality server, and then through that series of messaging that I described, it would then, I guess, be able to with better clarity, prioritization, classification, determine in fact which is the best serving site. And then that would be the site in which your talk channel is assigned.
Now, the signal from the phone to the cell site or the cell site to the phone, what kind of signal is that? Or how are those two things communicating? What method is it used?
I mean, it's a simple radio, if that's what you mean.
That's what I'm asking.
Okay.
So describe that, please.
So the cell site that I described 2 blocks over, for example, has a series of 4 antennas, transmit and receive across multiple antennas, or I should say up to 4 antennas. It's not always that many. And it is both transmitting down to the phone as well as receiving measurements and notification from the site. So 2-directional transmit and receive.
Just radio waves?
Yep, same thing with the phone. The phone, at one point, I think it's safe to say has 3, we'll say 2 antennae. It might be 3, potentially. But it does the same thing. It's transmitting and receiving at the same time, back and forth between it and the cell site.
And then once the signal gets to the cell site or cell tower, how does it travel in through the network until it gets to the other side if it goes to a cellular tower?
It's converted over fiber digitally back to the switch, over landline or fiber in most cases.
All through that, in the case of your Sprint caller, through the Sprint network?
Yeah, and I mean, there is a conversion back over to IP, and there's data packets, for example, that are captured and stored. It's a very efficient system, especially nowadays with the LTE portion.
Now, the records that Sprint keeps regarding cell site locations for communications of a Sprint customer into the Sprint network, do those show specifically the cell sites that were used by the identified Sprint customer on the record?
Yes. Yes, they do.
And so that's just the communication between your Sprint customer who's listed on the record and a specific Sprint site. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Now, you described, I think, in the course of what you were just telling us about a handoff. Is that true? You mentioned the phrase handoff.
I did, yes.
And could you tell us what is a handoff and how does that fit in this system that you just laid out for us?
So a handoff is the transaction from site to site as one would move based on, again, the prioritization of the neighbor lists.
And just tell us how that happens in the network, please.
With reference to the call records, is that what you're asking?
Well, just in general, and then we're going to get to the call records.
Okay, all right. So if I'm in the middle of a site, for example, in the strongest area of coverage, and I travel, I don't know, a few blocks to the east, and I'm in the city, at a point, I would no longer be, I guess, at the same signal level in terms of being in the strongest part of that cell site. I would have traveled to, say, the fringe or the edge of service. When I do that, the site to the east, for example, the neighboring site, would be stronger. So my signal would drop, and the neighboring signal would increase. At a point, for let's say the midpoint between those two sites, I would be at equal strength. There are some, I guess, hysteresis, if you will, some buffer in there where as soon as the neighboring site got to be slightly stronger, I guess you would be inclined to hand over. That doesn't necessarily happen. Just so that you don't ping pong between both sites, we want to, I guess, delay that handover potentially. So there's a little buffer in there, which basically says that that neighboring site would have to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 6 dB stronger, or I guess more consistently strong is probably a better way to describe it, so that as I move from west to east, I can not only ensure a clean handover that doesn't necessarily go back towards that other site, but I could make sure that there's a potentially stronger server so that I don't falsely jump to what may be a momentarily stronger site, but in fact weaker, and then ultimately hand over and drop. So there's a little bit of buffer in there, but for the most part, that's what happens. You move from an area of weak coverage to an area of stronger coverage, and all the while not dropping your call, and everybody's happy.
Now, I'm going to show you Exhibit 248. Do you recognize what's in Exhibit 248?
I do.
And what do you recognize Exhibit 248 to be, please?
So this would be very similar to the call records that I reviewed, which has a capture of a specific phone number, calls made or received to that phone, time and date in terms of start of the call, time and date in terms of end of the call duration. There's a network ID, there's a repoll number, and then more importantly for the conversation that we've had so far, the first site and the last site. So when did the call start, when did it end, and on which sites did that take place?
And I'm just going to show you Exhibit number 247. You recognize Exhibit 247?
I do.
And there's some additional records, but just tell us, generally speaking, what that type of information is, please.
So this is a capture of the cell sites in the entire network. So it's probably safe to say within that specific switch, this happens to be the Woburn switch. So you have our cell site number, you have the switch name, you have the network ID, the repoll number, you have the site name, which is generally an area description. You have the address, the city, the county, state, zip code, latitude and longitude, who the equipment provider is, the sector, the direction of that sector, and then the on-air status.
And do you use, for instance, this type of record, Exhibit 247, when you're trying to determine the location, as you described it, of the first cell and the last cell listed in Exhibit number 248?
Yes, you need both to be able to not only map those locations, but also decipher the data. Yes.
Now, were you asked, in the course of your duties, you're familiar with the Sprint equipment and how to take a look at these records and identify the Sprint equipment, is that correct?
Yes.
And were you asked to actually take a look at records identified, or strike that, the cell locations, a number of them identified in exhibit number 248, and determine their locations and sort of how they fit together for a period of time beginning on June 16th of 2013.
I did.
And did you travel to each of those cell locations and identify the cell sites?
I did, yes.
And I'm going to ask you, beginning on exhibit number 248, that transaction, that cellular telephone call, just above the ruler there on the exhibit, do you recognize that particular telephone call?
In terms of site?
As a call that you were asked to take a look at and to visit a cell site.
Oh, yes.
And
Yes.
just describe now, so we're going to start with the record. Describe what appears beginning on the left-hand side as we move to the right-hand side of the exhibit. Please.
So phone number 203-606-8969, called into 860-854-4304 at 6/16/2013 at 17:30 and 5 seconds for a duration of 58 seconds. On network ID 113, repole number 240, and cell site 129 was utilized.
And did you, that repole number, 240, I'm just going to show you, or the NEID 113 and the repole number 240, you recognize that as being a Sprint cellular tower, is that correct?
Actually, the repole number 240 is referring to the Wallingford switch. So that's the switch that resides in Wallingford, Connecticut.
Okay, and when you made that determination, did you reference this portion of exhibit number 247? The cell site location for 113?
Yeah, that is captured in there, yes.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Wallingford switch on your own?
Yeah, I actually work in that building, yes.
Okay. So, just tell us now, looking at this portion of exhibit 247, how it is that you go about locating the switch using the record.
So the leftmost column is a numerical listing of the cell site ID. I can't actually see.
I'm sorry.
No, I got it.
A lot of information.
No, I'm good. That's a numerical listing of the cell site IDs. So there are, give or take, about 600 plus sites in the Wallingford switch, and they're listed numerically, not sequentially, by the way. There are some numbers that skip. The second column is the cell site ID. So that would be the Cascade ID, excuse me, and that's the number that appears in many of our databases. Just easier to reference that way. Third column is a capture entitled Wallingford switch, so it's all of the sites that reside in that switch. The fourth line is the network ID, the 113 reference, which really is a reference to the cell sites within that switch, not necessarily the switch. The repole number, 240, is a reference to the switch itself. And then you have a breakout of the site names, site addresses, city, county, state, zip code, latitude, longitude, who the equipment provider is, the sector of the individual sites, and then the direction or azimuth of those antenna, and then also its status on air, pending, whatever the case may be.
And is that the status as of the time this record was compiled?
Yes. That's how those are provided when the call records are provided in cases.
Okay. Now, going back to our line here in exhibit number 248, this call at 1930, were you able to determine within the Wallingford switch the location of that cell site?
So yeah, that call occurred on cell site 129.
And tell us how you know that that's cell site number 129.
So on the far right, the first and the last cell column, the first number that you see there, the 4 that's referenced, that's actually the sector or the direction in which the call is processed. The antenna within the site that has processed that call. The last 3 digits, and there are some cases that it's really that can be 4 digits, is the cell site ID. So if you take the first number, separate that by the last 4, you have the sector and site that covered that site, that processed that call.
And just going back to exhibit number 247, cell site locations for the Wallingford switch. You see there's a
Yes, cell site 129 is referenced there. So,
and that gives a latitude and longitude,
it does, yes.
as well as a site name and an address. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's, I guess you would say that's a nickname. That's the Glaskey Smokestack. The actual address is 575 Broad Street in Bristol, Connecticut.
And in fact, you visited that location, is that correct?
I did.
And I'm going to show you this photograph. Do you recognize that particular photograph?
That would be cell site 129, yes.
And that's how it appeared to you upon your visit to it, is that correct?
That's right,
And is
yes.
that reasonably the same condition it was in back in June of 2013?
Yes, I'd say that's true, yes.
Okay. Now, that's located in Bristol, Connecticut, is that correct?
It is?
And did you then visit over the period of time, beginning on June 16th, a number of different cell site locations?
I did. I could tell you how many if you'd like to know.
Yes.
I visited 47 different sites.
And did you do you have photographs of each of those locations?
Yes.
And I'm showing you a packet of photos. Do you recognize those?
Yes.
And what are those, please?
Well, actually, I should probably, sorry. I don't want to assume anything. So yes, this is a collection of the 47 sites that I visited. Now, these are aerial photos, but I visited them by car, just to be overly clear.
And fair to say that at certain locations in the call records, the sites appeared more than one time, is that correct?
Yes, there were multiple. I might have that too, but. Well, we'll say there were 131 active calls that I was really looking at. But your question was, did those sites repeat?
Some on the...
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
Now, I'm going to show you, so I'm going to offer these photographs as the next exhibit.
Your Honor, there's writing on these photographs, so I don't think it's appropriate to put them in as exhibits unless the writing is going to be redacted. So I object.
And that's they be marked as a chalk.
I have no objections to that, Your Honor.
But are you going to show them?
Yes,
Writing.
a chalk to be shown to the jury to aid in the understanding. So demonstrative aid, I guess, is more apt than a chalk. But
I'd say for a
You may.
second. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it being exhibited to the jury, Your Honor, but not admitted into evidence.
Maybe mark for identification.
no, let's just mark them one as an active.
Because we got a late start this morning because of the snow, I was not planning to take a morning recess before 1, but if any of you need a recess, if any of you need a break, please don't hesitate, raise your hand and we'll stop and take a short recess. Did some-
Yeah.
We will then. I just indicated that we would stop and take a short recess if someone needed it. I hadn't planned to necessarily because we got a late start. One of you has raised your hand, so we will stop and take a short morning recess at this time.
But all right, jury, please.